Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Danya Sherman. I'm the Director of Public Programs for Friends of the High Line. And welcome. This is the second of 3 talks on the third section of the High Line, which runs between 30th and 34th Street. And we're still hoping to get the okay to save and reuse as a public park. Last week we had Joel Sternfeld, who took some original photographs of what the High Line looked like when it was still wild. And next Wednesday we have our co-founder, Robert Hammond, speaking about advocacy and sort of management of the park. So I hope you'll join us for that. It's next Wednesday here at 7 p.m. And I also wanted to let you know that we're in the midst of a Trains on Film series. This Friday we are screening Strangers on a Train, fabulous Hitchcock thriller, at 7 p.m. here, followed by a short film called All Aboard that was made just for the High Line. That is a fantastic series of clips from old movies and new movies, all featuring trains from throughout the era. It's a lot of fun. So that'll be screening before and after Strangers on a Train. And we're also going to be showing Some Like It Hot later in October. And I also wanted to mention a lot of our supporters, both volunteers, members, donors are here this evening, and I wanted to thank you all. A lot of our staff are here as well. A lot goes into maintaining and operating the park, and Friends of the High Line is transitioned now from we still do advocacy for the third section, but we also manage and operate the park and raise over 70% of the funds every year to do so. So thank you all for everything that you can do to support the park. And I also wanted to thank, in particular, the Tiffany Co Foundation, the New York Community Trust, the LuEsther T Mertz Advised Fund, the Green Acre Foundation, and the New York State Council on the Arts for supporting these programs. So now I'm going to introduce Melissa Fisher, our Director of Operations and Horticulture, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thanks, Danya, and thank you so much to everybody for coming out. It's amazing to see a space, which by day is a tunnel and construction site, be transformed into a lecture space full of interesting people who've gathered tonight. So thank you all for joining us. It is such a pleasure to have Rick Darke with us tonight. Rick is known by many of you for a variety of expertise areas, including horticulture, photography, writing, ecological consulting, deep thinking about ecology within the context of urban environments. He's traveled extensively throughout the world, and I could speak on and on about all that Rick has done and all that Rick does bring to the topic of the High Line and how it fits in to an ecological context in New York City and its application across the country and with a global perspective. One thing that I found in looking through Rick's very long and interesting bio is the remarks that he made as he addressed the class of 2009 at the Conway School of Landscape Design, where he was awarded an honorary degree in 2009. And I wanted to just quickly read that before we let Rick come on up. So in addressing the students who were graduating in the summer of 2009, at the same time that we were opening the first half-mile portion of the High Line, Rick said, "Have any of you heard of the High Line in New York? It opened just weeks ago." Humidity tonight. He went on to say, "Do you know how many people have walked in it in less than 3 weeks' time? Over 100,000. Friends of the High Line founders Robert Hammond and Joshua David re-envisioned a derelict Manhattan rail line that was an eyesore and a supposed safety hazard. And using Joel Steinfeld's pictures of emergent ecologies 40 feet in the air, he convinced people to contribute millions of dollars to the project. And what is it? It's a new kind of place based upon a regenerative landscape up in the sky. He went on to say, "I watched it for years, before anything was done to it. you could go up to the top of the Empire State Building and look at a green ribbon starting at the Javits Convention Center and going down to Chelsea. Do you know who watered it? Do you know who fertilized it? Know who protected it from PCB-laden ballast from electric railroads that were up there? Nobody. But it was a garden that could capture a public's imagination to the point that it could raise that kind of money. And it was a derelict railway. So we are so excited to have Rick Darke with us, who admittedly is one of the first trespassers on the High Line, to share with us his thoughts, particularly as we move into a phase where we're going to be thinking more about Section 3, the third and final stage of build out ahead of us here at the High Line. So without saying anything more, I'd like to just welcome Rick. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Jordan. Thank you, Melissa. I have trespassed on the High Line, but I actually started off, and you can take them all out. Take this off too. I started off with an invitation from Robert Hammond and Joshua David. There was a group from Historic Hudson Highlands, Highline that was going up here, and I really wanted to see it. And at that time, CSX was really trying to make sure that nobody hurt themselves on the line. And so next year it'll be 10 years. It's been just extraordinary to think of what has happened in that 10 years. How many of you have ever taken a walk on the High Line before it opened? It's dark in here. You can raise your hand. Nobody can see. Okay, a few. How many of you got hurt doing it? Robert and Melissa asked me to talk about the High Line's wild gardens, and that is my focus tonight. I've seen an awful lot of things on this landscape over those 10 years, but the theme of wildness, I think, is one that has a lot to do with many ways that we're approaching modern landscape, and I think sometimes we don't think as deeply as we might about it, and it's fun to do so. There's a photograph taken of the High Line before anything was done to it. This is on the rail yard section, which is the still wild section of the High Line. And talking about wildness, one of the things that I realized as I started working with this is that in common culture, everybody knows the term wilderness. We very often mistake the terms wildness and wilderness. We use them interchangeably. But they're not interchangeable at all, and the differences are really profound when it comes to managing landscapes. This is the White Clay Valley. Melinda, my wife Melinda, and I, we're both in the general sphere of ecological horticulture, if that's a field. We live in Chester County, Pennsylvania. We took the train up here today. And that's the White Clay Creek. I could show that photograph to a number of people and tell them it's wilderness. It's just a wild place untouched. It's not at all. This is all tertiary regrowth. This is clearly a modern forest. It's wild compared to a lot of places, but it's not a wilderness. If a wilderness is a place where there just are no people, it's some pristine place where the last best things reside, this is not that. But are there things happening here that are fully autonomous? Sure there are. If you take a look at that from another direction, all of a sudden you see order. So this is an interactive presentation. I want you to tell me, what's that? It's a body of water, right? It's the White Clay Creek. So you have two other lines in the landscape. What are they? What could they be? A road and a railroad, right? That's right. So there's the road, that's the old county road. In that area, this is an old area that goes back to 1700s. This is the railroad, which goes to 1800s. And those from a helicopter, this is from a Bell Ranger helicopter, all still visible. The imprints of those are still visible this long afterwards. That railroad has not had trains on it since 1928. All the metal was pulled up by the time of the Second World War. This is all a preserve now, by the way. The whole place has been set aside. It was bought by the DuPont company. They had intended to dam the valley and create a commercial corridor based upon industry that could feed on the water. That was an unpopular idea. And then, by happenstance, this place that was accumulated and abandoned became a preserve. So there are the three lines. Sometimes when you get up high in the air and you look at these things, the patterns are much more evident. So if I say to you now, where are the three lines? Where's the road, the creek, and the railroad? There's evidence in this picture of all three of them, but only two are really obvious. The creek is always the obvious one. This is the railroad because this is the same orientation as before. The road is evident because there are sycamore trees growing in a pattern along the road. So even though you can't see the road below those trees, from the air, the vegetation reveals the pattern of the road. So now that you're all primed for that, where's the railroad in this picture? All of this vegetation is only there because there was a railroad that went through there. At that point, it went through pasture land and farm fields. When the railroad was abandoned, these trees all found refuge in a zone where nobody owned it. Nobody's farming it, nobody's grazing it. And so you've got 80 and 90 foot tall sycamore trees and all kinds of things that go right down to the base that are just part of the railroad. And to prove it to you, if I look at it like this, there's where the railroad crossed the creek. So these are ghosts, these are patterns that linger a lot longer than we imagine. And for me, the history of the landscape is a big part of the intrigue. And if you can learn to read these things, it's really important. Now, I did spend 20 years at Longwood Gardens. Has anybody here ever been to Longwood Gardens? Okay, surprising number of hands. And I'm asking these questions for you as much as for me. So Longwood was the estate of Pierre-S. DuPont. There's a connection to New York because Pierre-S. DuPont worked with John Jacob Raskob. Raskob convinced him that his friend Al Smith was right and they really ought to put up a building in Midtown that was taller than anything else. So they built the empty State Building, and it wasn't a commercial success until many decades later, but Pierre DuPont, who built Longwood, was one of the main financial backers and was a board member of the Empire State Building. And if you go in and look at that plaque in the bottom of the building, there's Pierre-S. DuPont of Longwood. So I was working at Longwood Gardens, started in the late 70s, trying to make a garden that reflected what intrigued me, which was all of the nuance and the happenstance and the intrigue of local fields and forests. And like Longwood, I couldn't find it looking at Longwood. So I decided I'm going to go back to the source to see if I can understand how does this intrigue really work. I had to each day, going from Newark, Delaware, drive down this road and cross over a bridge. And I decided I'm going to take as many pictures as I can from that bridge in 1 year and see what I can learn, see if I can go back to that. We actually published this in a book called The American Woodland Garden about 10 years ago. So this is a scanned slide, but there is 1983, so it's in 2 years, it'll be 30 years ago. I took all those and I cast them up on a wall. You remember what a slide is? It's film, it's chemicals on a piece of clear sheet. Cast it up on the wall and drew it, and then labeled all of the major characters, because they were going to be actors in a play. I didn't realize at the time I've been following it for 30 years. So if you then just put yourself in that position, and there were a couple mornings that I was a little late getting to work for this, but all of us should allow ourselves 5 minutes, even if it means getting yelled at just a little bit. You can take 5 minutes out of the day to see what is happening that you didn't plan on. So there is March 1983. Let me just go forward a little bit into April. Nothing's blooming. This is just a wild habitat, not the wilderness, this is the suburbs. This is Chester County, Pennsylvania. Now let me take you forward 5 days. Can you imagine what 5 days difference will make in a regional landscape? Have you got it in your head? You got a picture in your head? 5 days. Doesn't matter that the dogwood's blooming. So often people that are involved in gardens and horticulture, if it ain't blooming, it don't count. And part of what I was trying to do is reinforce for myself that a lot of what I've known and loved about local happenstantial landscapes has to do with pattern and framing and nuance and distance and mood and all these things that imbue the landscape with value and wonder that have nothing to do with a moment of bloom. I took this photograph, and back at this time, I was taking pictures with a camera that didn't make notes about when and where I took the picture, so I had to write it on a piece of paper. And I made a note to myself that morning naively saying that I've lost the depth of my scene, because I couldn't see down the creek. This is May 9th, and all of a sudden, the leaves have gotten big enough that the shadows are coming across here. I've got this arc of this sycamore and this ash tree and this fallen tulip poplar making this very recognizable frame, and I thought, I've lost the depth of my scene, and I'll get it back in fall when the leaves fall off the trees. Then I took the same photograph at the end of the same day. Now, can you imagine if I say, there's the morning, what does the evening look like? This is about 7:30 in the morning. Let's go to about 4:30 in the afternoon. Have you got it in your head? Same day. I was clueless to how different it was, how far you could see. It all had to do with the direction of the light. And I know from walking the High Line over these almost last 10 years that a lot of the beauty of the High Line has to do with the way the light is moving across the landscape. These are really valuable, powerful things. If I said to you, let's use the terminology that describes mood. Forget about design terms. Just describe this in terms of mood. And then describe that in terms of mood. If you made yourself little lists, you come up with very different words. Yet we don't very often take those values and say, this is what my landscape is about. Of course, I'd wondered how long was it going to take for nature, whatever you want to call it, to move this tree out of the landscape. I didn't know at the time, but it was going to be 13 years. At that time, with a film camera, it was difficult to capture a bird making an arc to land on a tree. Now this stuff's very easy. But at that time, that was a big deal. That was August. Those were literally the dog days of August. By documenting this, I could reinforce my memory and understand all the different patterns and the chronology of the way dogwoods turn color, spice bushes turn color, beeches turn color. How fleeting is the color of a beech? One hard frost, just like one hard frost. How many of you know the High Line well enough to know what happens after the first hard frost comes through? It changes the color in 100 different things in this landscape. And if you're walking it often, or if you know how these things react, you see this stuff. Because I had made a pact with myself to take photographs as often as I could, I didn't shy away from those times when we might say, let's stay indoors and watch something. I was just trying to be routine about understanding what really is the mood of that place in all times. And that was a flood where we actually got some 13 inches of rain in 24 hours. Sort of like we did a number of times this summer, it feels like. I took geology and geography and meteorology in school, and I learned a little bit about how the sun moves. So if I said to you, okay, how much do you remember about solstice and equinox? Anybody here an expert on that? So if this is looking west, and this is January 18th, if I show you a photograph 1 week later at the exact same time, 4:20 p.m., which direction will the sun have moved to? You can say right or left. To the right and higher. But it's all about perspective. It's where we are. Just like walking this line one way gives you an entire different experience than walking it the other way. At that time, because I'd become intimate with the scene, I could have told you, this is exactly 1 year from when I started, could have told you 50 things that had changed. I don't remember all those now. Some of them are very obvious. But anytime we become intimate with a landscape, we see that much more detail. It's been, again, almost 30 years. I don't commute out that way anymore, but I've taken photographs whenever I can. I can tell you without a doubt, there are, you hear about the biennial flowering of dogwoods. It's true. More or less, every second year, they bloom better. There's no time. How many of you have been on the High Line in the winter? It's a beautiful time. I've had people say, well, is it open in the wintertime? Well, of course it's open in the wintertime, and it's a fabulous time to walk the city and a fabulous time to walk the line. And if you're looking to understand structure in a scene, like this whole drama of when is that tulip tree going to be erased from there, winter is the way to see exactly what happens. It just maps it right out for you. I've been fortunate to be working for the last 4 or 5 years with Falling Water. That's the Frank Lloyd Wright site out in western Pennsylvania. And I got a wonderful call from the curator and the horticulturist just saying, we need some help with some dynamics of our landscape. It's really not landscape architecture, it's not really design, but we need help. We're trying to do something with this site that is authentic to the house. And the house was set into a wild landscape, and our charge, our mission is to keep it like that, not to make it look too fussed up. And one of the things that this photograph kind of captures for me, and Wright knew this very well, is that line between what is clearly the built landscape and what is the wild landscape, and this is part of Falling Water. That line is a wonderful line of tension. It's a wonderful line of intrigue, and there's a photograph taken in black and white with a modern camera, and then if I just fade it to the same photograph taken in color with the same camera, there's today, and there is a landscape that, Frank Lloyd Wright nor the Kaufmans planted any one of these plants. But they're all local things that seeded into niches that have been allowed to be available. That's wildness. That's wildness. So is that. Every one of these things, nothing planted. This is all spontaneous, happenstantial vegetation. Now that is a maintained garden, and part of what Justin and Ann were asking me out for is, we're maintaining something like that. We kind of want it to look like that. How do you do that? How do you work with these things where you are intervening, but you're intervening wisely, gently, with insight? You're constantly reading and rereading to see what you do, the cause and effect of every one of your actions. You can take a look at a scene like this and say, oh, it's the natural landscape, whatever that is. But this is a cultural landscape. And that pattern of that moss on that falls changes with the development patterns upstream. This pattern right here, if there isn't gentle tweaking, the stairway that comes down there becomes impassable. There's very gentle gardening going on here. By the way, unless I tell you, like that one shot that I took in black and white, all these photographs are just as they come off the camera, other than brightening or darkening them a little bit to get them all even for this. Nothing's been photoshopped to make it more colorful or hype it up or add contrast. That's just looking at the tracks of trees in my local White Clay Creek. Now brace yourself, because this is getting back to another interactive portion of this presentation. That's just that. Now, how many of you would like the photograph better if I didn't have that broken limb on the left? Be honest. Anybody here? Okay, that's all right. I think the porch is still open. They've got a Chardonnay. You can get a Merlot. But really, it's choice. It's all arbitrary. But I could have easily taken that photograph without that by stepping a little bit to the right. Different purposes, different images. This is that happenstantial landscape. That is that creek. I look at this photograph, I'm not bothered by that. I'm bothered by the amount of erosion on the bank because I know what it means. But, because this is a talk about rail yards, and there's the railroad again. That's the Pomeroy Railroad that stopped running trains in 1928. Now, here's the question. You're studying wildness in the landscape. You're trying to understand vegetative dynamics. And you've got to look at the likelihood of where you might or might not be able to get trees established in this landscape. And I'm going to say to you, what direction is the water flowing? Now, before any of you answer, because I can see there are a number of eager people, you can't use gravity as part of your logic. So anything that says, for example, oh, I see ripples here and I know that water flows downhill, so that must be lower there and the water must be flowing that way. Out of the question. Can't use that kind of logic. You've got to answer this question based upon some other reasoning. And just to, not to intimidate you, but I used this image recently in a course I co-teach on plants and human culture at the University of Delaware along with Sue Barton. And this is a course that fulfills a multicultural requirement and a science requirement for non-majors. So we get a lot of people in there that are in, you name it, engineering, economics, whatever. And a marketing major got this answer. So this is just common sense. It has nothing to do with ecology, horticulture, any of that training. Tell me. Anybody? If you don't answer, I'll call on John. Look at it. Common sense. Tell me, without using the logic of gravity, what direction is the water flowing? And think about wildness and think about dynamics. This young marketing major, she said, well, I think it's got to be flowing that way because I see trees that have established themselves on the far side of these abutments. And I think they found refuge from the brunt of the current. That's the answer I was looking for. So that's the dynamics of wild vegetation. Any tree that seeds in there, and they do all the time, any tree that seeds in there will be wiped out before it reaches 80 feet in height. So if you were working with a site like this, and you said, oh, I really like these things, they each look great with a tree next to them. I think I'll put them in the front. Bad idea. That's taking an observation of wild dynamics and putting it into strategy that has to do with landscape management. Some of you in horticulture may know that there actually is a plant called the Japanese painted fern. This is not it. This is an Asplenium platyneuron. It's the ebony spleenwort. And this is still the Pomeroy Railroad. So why is that plant growing there? Because it likes to be spray painted? Is it going to die? It's just been spray painted, obviously. Is it going to die? Okay, I took that photograph, and 2 years later, I took the same plant again. You ready for what that plant did 2 years later? Same plant. Exact same fern. But why is it there to begin with? That is a trestle support that was done out of native stone by a branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad called the Pomeroy. And how did they put the stone together? Is it all dry laid stone? No, it's mortared. What's in mortar? Chemicals that leach into the environment and make it a more alkaline environment. So that fern prefers, or it is better adapted to alkaline environments. It's growing there because even though they weren't planning on it, 100 years earlier, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Pomeroy Division set some things into place that created an alkaline environment in the cracks between those rocks. And this is habitat. So now, if I say to you, here's indubitably, this is a locally indigenous fern. Anybody that wants to play native exotics, this is native. So is that the native habitat of this fern if that is 2009? Anybody? Yes? Yes? Anyone knows? Yes, of course. What else could it be? This is a photograph 2 weeks ago, and they're quite happy there. There's not only those ferns, there are Christmas ferns, all seeding, and these are all ferns that, it's not that they really love alkaline environments, it's that they can endure alkaline environments, and a lot of other plants can't. Part of what you see along the High Line now, and in the past, is that the plants out there either are or are not adapted to the conditions that exist now. And they will constantly reorganize themselves according to opportunity. This is quite a while ago, looking at that wonderful old grading that was done by the New York Central lines. And if you've noticed, it only has this decorative element as it crosses streets. They were that aware of it. Was looking recently into the west side elevated, and I hadn't really realized how similar these railings were, except that there were only rectangular plates occasionally on the west side elevated, and this had diamonds on it, but all the same period. That's a 2002 photograph that was taken with a Sony camera the first day that I walked the line with Robert and Josh. And I'd like to joke about this. At that time, the High Line really wasn't ready for prime time. It wasn't ready for bare calves and high heels, but it was a glorious space. It was this impossible vistas. Very often you couldn't tell when it ended. I have missed this smokestack very much. But there are elements that constantly come in and move from these landscapes. I took this in 2003 in the cold rain and snow, and it was, I just put the camera up, and the first thing that happened is I filled the viewfinder with the letters P-A-R-K, and I thought it was a sign. It actually said parking, of course. And this lettering actually goes back to the New York Central days, when this said parking related to the 30th Street yards. Back at that time, you could see stuff like this, and I love this. How many of you know the word palimpsest? It's a term that John Stilgoe used, I think, in an introductory piece, maybe for that Joel Sternfeld book. But it's a palimpsest is a parchment or an entablature that's been written on many times, each time the previous writing having been imperfectly erased, and is therefore partially legible. Well, that's kind of that. And if you look at that history of that, that it's been painted over many times and changed colors many times, and it's still beautiful, because this is a photograph just very recently. I love the balance that the High Line makes between pretty and gritty. It just seems so appropriate to New York, though, those fabulous diamonds. I was actually walking with my friend Paul Van Meter this day when I took that photograph. This was in front of the DEA building, not very far from here, and we were taking this photograph from a sidewalk. So I'm on the sidewalk, which, as far as I know, is public space in New York. Maybe you know differently, but I'm taking a picture, and a guy comes out of the door and he says, "You can't take a picture here." And I said, "I'm taking a picture up there. I'm standing on the sidewalk." He said, "You can't take a picture here." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "You can't take a picture here." I said, "Look, we're interested in this place. It's going to become, we hope, a new public park, and that is a crabapple that's naturalized up there." And he said, "Buddy, I know what you're talking about, but the guys upstairs don't see it that way." And it was a perfect disjunct of, this was 9/11. This is shortly after 9/11 still, when you can't take a picture on a train, you can't point a camera out a window. But it was two different worlds, but he did not make me erase my chip. How many of you know what that plant is? It's garden chives. Garden chives. So how did they get up on a freight railroad? Who knows? These are part of the mysteries of the High Line. But this is the wild section of the High Line. You could look at things like that. What does this mean? This is still up there. Still up, and it's part of the tracks that go along this part of the line. That's steel that was forged in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. In fact, I've walked this enough and looked at some of the tracks. If you look really closely at them, there's some that say Lackawanna. Now, this was the New York Central lines. So why do they have Lackawanna rails up there? Because they're reusing rails. These are big metal pieces of metal. They're reusing them. There is this kind of sustainable ethic that goes way back, and it's part of the story of the High Line. Just a little edge that is not salt, that is snow. Look at these mosses, and the mosses are creating a perfect substrate for other plants to seed into. This is wildness, even in these little micro habitats. A very early shot, 2002, and even at that time, there were birds scouting the rails, taking shelter in these shrubs, finding sustenance in the seeds and fruits of these plants. This is wild cherry. If you're reading any modern books now where ecologists are saying, make your list, like Doug Tallamy's book on bringing nature home, make a list of plants that have really high sustenance value. This is an indigenous plant. Really high sustenance value for local birds and insects and caterpillars. That's it. You know who planted that one? The wind. This is not a trick shot. Those dwarf bearded iris were in a former light stanchion. There was some kind of a signal light there that when emptied out formed a depression. It filled with what you might call soil, and the irises are blooming there with the chives. And this mix here is, there's poa, there's fescues, there is little blue stem, there were some Andropogon virginicus, here's goldenrods up there. But this is what the rail yard section still looks like. It's really quite a remarkable, happenstantial, spontaneous landscape. How many of you like the tracks? How many of you don't like the tracks? How many of you know what a sleeper is? Okay. Sleeper is a railroad tie. It's that, see, they're hidden right here, but they're the wood that holds the tracks down. Well, if you can read that, readers of poetry see the factory village and the railway and fancy that the poetry, the landscape is broken up by these. The poet sees them fall within the great order, not less than the beehive or the spider's geometrical web. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson from the second series of essays in 1844. And at that time, society is struggling with this idea of, oh, we've got all this machinery coming in, it's just messing everything up. How many of you are big fans of Thoreau? Okay, well then you're going to have to forgive me for this, because I think he was a depressive. He, if I can paraphrase this, he says back at the same time, is it not a maimed and imperfect nature I am conversant with? That's so sad. Thoreau was bothered, even though he walked the tracks, he was bothered by this stuff. And Emerson saw it as part of a continual evolving process, part of the bigger picture, and something to be invited into it. We did this, nobody else but humankind did that or that. I think it's beautiful. There was at one time a civilization just off the High Line that worshipped Coca-Cola. And they were excavating over there, and they actually found this. This is 2002. That we walked by when we got off the train today and walked down from Penn Station. They're still out there with these same Komatsus, only that Coke, which would have made a great wall hanging, is gone. But this is the kind of stuff that I've delighted in over the years. You just never know what's going to show up off the working landscape of the High Line. This is the straight and narrow of the High Line long before anything was done. And as an ecologist and field botanist, I look at something like this and I say, why? 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 Because they're all different things there. And they're all responding to history, to impact, to conditions, and then continuing process. So again, if I said to a young ecology student, go out there and map this and see if you can find any patterns that say what likes to grow, this is a potentilla, what likes to grow in that, call it deeper soil in there, full sun between the tries. There's the sleepers between the tracks. How about this shady little nest here? Why is that the perfect habitat for butter and eggs, Linaria vulgaris? And why, when you go out here, do you see other things into the ballast? You know, we don't know a lot of these answers. Even people that think they're the best gardeners and horticulturists in the world, we don't know the answers to these. But I can tell you this, that's all creating order without any input. And we're banding about this word sustainability these days, and it's all about resources. So if you can say that did that, it created order, and the amount of resources that were expended in doing that are pretty low, that's important. This was up right in this area. This is right out here. It's Great Muscari. Now, why would a bulb from the other part of the planet be out here? And why would it do well in the High Line? Why would it still? Because this is a plant from another part of the globe that's it's involved in an environment that there's a fair amount, there's always a lot of light, but there's a fair amount of moisture in spring, and then it becomes a baking desert. Well, this plant goes dormant. It's underground and dormant at a time when the desert is baking, or a place like the High Line without irrigation is baking. That's why it was up there. No input. By the way, how about these lovely sumacs? They are all ailanthus. There was never any sumac on the High Line except at the rail yards, where it still is. It's about shade. How many of you like ailanthus and have it in your garden? Okay, how about this? How many of you have this in your garden? I didn't plant it, but I have it in the garden. I love it. It is the wild progenitor of the cultivated carrot. It's Queen Anne's lace, Daucus carota. This is a photograph from this season on the High Line. And to me, it just fits so well with the Empire State Building and New York Central and the 30th Street yards, which are now the Long Island Railroad yards. And this is a completely adapted environment. All these things are out there. Look at that. Anybody doesn't think that's pretty? That's just this summer. Now, what kind of input goes into that? How much irrigation goes into it? How much fertilizer goes into it? How much maintenance goes into it? One big zero. So is that a native plant? Anybody here? Is that native? It was introduced to this country a little over 300 years ago. Anybody here who knows about natives and exotics knows how long it takes before something becomes native? Anybody? 300 years? Obviously not. 500 years? 1,000 years? I am ready to accord this plant, which it fulfills its entire life cycle in New York. It is a plant that sequesters carbon. It provides oxygen. If you look, there are a whole host of native indigenous caterpillars that feed on it. Bees and butterflies that suck nectar from its flowers. It's actually a very active plant in our regional ecologies and making its tithings to the trophic levels on a regular basis. So I'm ready to accord it honorary native status. But then how many of you anyway know how to define a native New Yorker? Anybody? The High Line has always had grasses as part of it and will always. And I think one of the really marvelous things that Pete Adolph did was he made grasses the matrix. Really, ultimately, most things on the High Line are set into a matrix of grasses. In this case, this is a lot of the inspiration. This is the rail yards just 2 years ago, and this is all Eupatorium altissimum. Nobody planted that up there. It's a plant I've seen on a number of different furnace sites and rail sites and post-industrial sites, and this is mostly little blue stem. Standing up tall, growing in mass. It's allelopathic. It likes to poison its neighbors, and that's how it makes these big sweeps. But it's really not a bad plant. It's just doing what it was bred to do. How about that? I mean, if I could design this and say, I did that, I'd be happy to call this my work. But this is just the wild rail yards. But there's a lot of wildness here, and you need to look closely to see how wildness survives in redesigned places, because we do need to be constantly allowing things to change due to function, due to needs. This is just Amsonia hebrictii, the threadleaf blue star, last week, just poking through those wonderful railings. Again, if you look at the High Line, the most common groups of plants on the High Line are grasses. There's a mix of them there. They feather out like this. They are the background against which all things go in. Grasses are not plants primarily beautiful for their flowers per se, or certainly not for color flowers. They're beautiful for their texture, for their line, for their form, for their movement, for the translucency. So here in November, in a rain in November, two Novembers ago, are grasses. They're the basis. They're not always the stars, but they are the most important supporting actors. And if you look at any place, you go out and look at the High Line, and you start saying, what would the High Line look like without its grasses? It would be unrecognizable. And that way it is pulling directly from the wild High Line. And if you look at this, there's quite a bit of a mix in here. This mix is something that is part of Pete Adolph's meticulous design, but Pete's designs are confident enough that he does intend for these things to evolve. He intends for them to change. He's a student. We've had a chance to travel a lot in different places, different countries with Pete. He's always looking and learning. And the High Line is a big experiment. You know, it's really one big green roof. And there's never been a big green linear roof done like this with this feral model. And so all of us are learning a lot. Those that observe it, those that use it, those that garden it, are learning a lot about how this works. What I love is that, and Joel Sternfeld last week was really eloquent about talking about growing up in Rockaway and Queens and loving these lots and these places that he played in and loving the dynamic of that, the intrigue of those places. And you can so easily find a place along the High Line where you're still surrounded by the wildness. Things are mutating, they are evolving, and they are never the same 2 years in a row. Just like on that original section of the rail yards and much of the section, the straightaway where the grass is dominated, they are, more than any one group, they are the plants that change the color of the High Line. So in a short while, the line will look like this. This is November. And then in winter, it will look like this. Part of the value that's been brought into this is that always, see all these beautiful seed heads? It's leaving things up instead of, years ago, I had some newspaper someplace called me and said, we'd love to do an article on how to put the garden to bed for winter. Could we interview you? And I said, I'd be happy to tell you about how you could just leave things up and learn to look at them differently. This is coming into common currency now, but at one time, it wouldn't have been tolerated to leave all these seed heads up. Now we can see that these are beautiful things. And, Pete has been eloquent about saying it's important, not that these are really dead, these plants aren't dying, but they are going into a dormancy. They're going into another cycle. And that whole senescence, it's important that that be as beautiful as their living, growing, full sun season presence, if the landscape's going to be beautiful. I'd love to be looking out this window. That is Solidago speciosa. That's one of our showiest Midwestern goldenrods along the High Line, again, set into a matrix of grasses just a week ago. If you were to count the seeds that are right now being produced on the grasses along the High Line, I can say confidently, I'm sure there are more than 100 million. And a lot of them are going to germinate. And so that means that there are going to be a lot of new grasses. They will find niches. They will move. If you're looking at the High Line closely enough, you will see that it constantly evolves. That is wildness still in action. Look at these. These are all seeds maturing. How many seeds are there in these plants? It's sculptural. It's dramatic. But it's life. Again, count the seeds. Every one of these little white dots is a seed. I love looking at the way the patterns change. So this is looking at that same spur over here. Let's just watch that through the seasons. Almost the exact same vantage point. Now at that particular point I was distracted because in all of this, and all these seeds that are already maturing on the asters, what cares about aster seeds besides asters in the Aster Procreation Society? Birds. Birds eat these seeds. So a little bit of sustenance in this wildness. Now watch it again. That is going to go to that. Exact same space, all in one season. So if you look at the colors that make this up, this is wild oats. These are northeastern indigenous grasses. You can't say to that grass, I'm going to put one patch right there, just stay there. These are plants that are tough enough, they're adapted enough, they move around, they find their niches. And their niche now is in the ecology that they know. It is the only ecology in New York. It is the ecology of 2011. This landscape now, as it was before, is a deeply layered landscape. If you look at this, there are ground layers, there are shrub layers, there are tree layers. And in there are numerous niches. How many of you have seen these? Good. We stopped last week just taking this picture, and in no time, we had 10 people around us wanting to know what they were. They are a local, native milkweed bug that's on milkweed. And that's a relationship with two plants. This is a photograph from this afternoon. Anybody out here that saw that peregrine falcon right up here? It's right here on the DEA building, my friends. Anybody here work at DEA? This is your falcon. Good, that's it. There's your falcon. So this is wildness. Now, why is that bird there? Looking for somebody to trip and fall, somebody with a weak ankle or something, you know. You trip and you don't get up, and the next thing you know, that thing's on top of you. There is so much wildness here if you know how to look. How many of you have noticed this fragrance right now along the High Line? Well, that's all Sporobolus, that's all prairie dropseed. It's this grass, this very feathery grass right here. Those are prime birdseed. And when the birds take the seeds, they're going to seed along the High Line, and then they're going to move this prairie grass, which is native as long as anything native to the Midwest is native to New York. Not always the case. And they're going to establish prairie dropseed in New York. How many of you grew up with the idea of nature? How many of you have heard the word before? I'm just checking to see if I'm getting appropriate responses here. I grew up with nature, and my mother loved nature, and I love from a kind of Pollyanna standpoint, it's a lovely idea. But I think it's the word that gets us in trouble. Nature's always associated with a dichotomy. There is always, of course, man and nature. And it's the way that we can say, nature is on autopilot and fixes everything and does everything lovely, and the stuff that we do is outside of it, and it should just fix it too. And it just absolves us of responsibility. In fact, I think it's much more rational to use this definition that I've learned from Raymond Williams' Ideas of Nature in 1980. He said, nature is just a singular term for the multiplicity of things and living processes. Now, how many of you, if I took away the word nature and made you use this definition, how many of you could live with that? Nobody? It's really pretty inviting. It's very inclusive. It doesn't say, don't think about lovely ideas and good or intent. It just says we're part of the equation. We always have been part of the equation, and it's a really good idea to recognize that. If you look at the High Line and you look at direct models of the High Line, like right down here, that are directly modeled on wildness, if I say, okay, here's under construction, here's snow, makes the landscape really easy to interpret, there are these crossing tracks, put back down, and this is the gray birch. It's not the canoe birch of New England. Why? Because the canoe birch of New England would be dead here by the July of the first year. It's not heat tolerant. This is a birch. It's an unsung birch that's not popular in gardens because it doesn't compare to the white birch of New England, which doesn't grow here, or the white birch of Europe, which also doesn't grow here very well. This is smaller, but it's still quite beautiful, and that's what was planted on the High Line, because this is the birch that seeds into gob piles, old piles of refuse from coal mines. It's the birch that seeds into old railroad tracks. That's not the High Line, that's Lansford, PA. It's an old coal mining town near Tamaqua, and that is just wildness, and all these birches are just seeding in between tracks that obviously haven't seen traffic in quite a while. There they are, along with some of these oaks, reclaiming a toxified landscape. This is all detritus. This is all the refuse from coal mines. It's a very acidic environment, and that birch can take that. Can you imagine how dry it is up there? Can you imagine what that's growing in? It can tolerate that. And that's why this is down there. If you take some of these motifs and say, let's say we're in an era right now where, the Industrial Revolution is not looming, it's over. So now we can, I think, look back on the machine age with a little bit of nostalgia, with a sense of confidence that says, I can take a look at that and say, it's pretty, and we're losing some of it, and maybe we ought to save just a little bit of it. I love this. This is just old mining machinery out in that same part of Pennsylvania with a wild garden coming up around it. I have nothing against the French. I have nothing against parks. But Melinda and I made a trip for her birthday, and we went up to the top of the Eiffel Tower, and I was doing studies on what dogs do in parks. And they do the same thing the world round. Whenever parks don't have enough diversity, they get bored and they relieve themselves of that boredom. Well, by the time I would be walking around here, I don't think I'd need to see that second part of it. This is a really wonderful landscape to photograph from the top of a tall tower. But it is a very rigid design that offers no intrigue, no change, no serendipity. It is all about an era when we were still trying to impose order on the landscape. So, where are you? You're still in Paris. Are you at grade? You're not at grade right now. You're 30 feet in the air. Are you at grade there? No, you're 30 feet in the air. How can you tell? Because if I show you another photograph, you can kind of get an idea now. This is the Promenade Puente. And it's a great space, and I'm glad it's there. It's the old Bastille line. It's in the 12th. And it is the place that many of you who were, listening to all the stories about the fact that we really could make a new park along this thing on the west side of New York, this was the only real model that could be held up on an international basis. The Promenade Puente in Paris was held up as saying, it's been done, it could be done again. Well, this is typically French. It is an old rail line. You're on top of a rail line there. This is not low maintenance gardening. Any of you that don't know anything about horticulture, let me tell you, this is not low maintenance gardening. But even though it's an interesting walk, and it's quite long, this is what they did with this old viaduct, and they remade it into something that looks, to my eye, a lot more like Longwood Gardens. These are not self-pruning hedges, and I can prove that to you. So when I saw this, and I remember having this conversation with Robert, it's a great model in that it remade this part of the city, but please don't make the High Line look like that. Because this is all about control. This is the model of control. And the High Line had so much more potential. This relies very much on clipped shrubs. In fact, these fabulous buildings, you've got to find opportunities to look beyond them because you're mostly walled in. Now on the street level, what a model. This incredible old, there are 70 of these arches. And what they did, the city of Paris actually got together and they redid these into studios and workshops for artists interspersed with cafes. And this is the wildest place. This is the Viaduct des Arts, and this runs along the avenue for a couple miles outside of where the Gare de Bastille used to be, the station. But if you actually wanted to go back and say, what is the earliest progenitor of the High Line? This is it. This is in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. It was a trolley line. And this, to my knowledge, is the first place in America or anywhere where a group of community people got together and said, there's a derelict eyesore that once had things running on rails. This was a standard gauge trolley line. Let's make it into a linear park. And the Shelburne Falls Garden Club took this, which had gone derelict. The trolleys were out of business by 1927. By 1929, they'd opened it as the Bridge of Flowers. And except for a few days recently during Irene, it's been open every day since by the Shelburne Falls Garden Club. This is the Bridge of Flowers in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. It's not as formal as the Promenade Puente, but it's planted, it's flowers. This, interestingly, is not a green roof. They've got soil depths that go down, in some cases, 12 feet, because there was fill inside this concrete structure. The reason that survives is because that trolley bridge, the trolleys went out of business, but they had poured this concrete arch bridge with the water main that connects Buckland and Shelburne Falls in the bridge, so they couldn't take the bridge out. So they had to find out something else to do with it, and that's what they did. Has anybody here ever been to Hoboken or Jersey City? Okay. How many of you have been up on the Harsimus Stem Embankment? It's another place that has had a bit of a leg up from the High Line. It's still a difficult issue, mostly because of ownership issues. But this is stone that was done by the Pennsylvania Railroad a long time ago. There are sections that are disconnected now that once ran high tracks out to the river. And if you go walk over there, they're hoping to make this into another High Line. Look at this, same pattern that I was seeing, the same little asplenium in my tracks in Pennsylvania and Delaware. There they are up there. Now, why are they up there? Because the railroad used the same mortar, its habitat. So if you're looking at this and you say, this is quite a bit of a forest up there, this is what it looks like. There are a number of these big sections, and the idea would be reconnect them with bridges. There were metal bridges to carry the tracks. Right now they're all segregate. It would make a wonderful walking linear park. Well, you can actually, if you go out to the river end of it, that's where it gets down close to grade. You can get on it and you can walk it. Now, can you imagine what it looks like? If I say this is big and it's broad, it's also got huge planting depth. And there are grasses and everything else that are seeding up there. And nobody's done anything at all. What does the garden look like on top of the Harsema stem embankment? That's what it looks like. It's all the same grasses that we're all in love with, all the little blue stems, all the eupatoriums, all these native oaks. This is that plant I wanted to make a native. It's pretty good. No input. That's a wild garden. That's wildness. My friend Paul Van Meter is here representing Philadelphia tonight, the Reading Viaduct. The Reading Viaduct was done by the Reading Railroad, but the Reading Viaduct is in Philadelphia. This is it, and it is probably the other high line, the other potential high line that bears the closest resemblance to this high line. It is an elevated rail line that at one time headed out from Reading Terminal and actually connected with bigger city divisions that were at and below grade. But it's still there. It runs on steel for some sections, mostly on stone and concrete. It's elevated. It was electrified, unlike the High Line, which had to have self-powered locomotives on here. They actually used tri-powered locomotives, if you ever wondered. They had locomotives at that time, New York Central owned locomotives, that actually could run on third rail, or they had diesel power in them, or they could run with catenary. And once they got up on the High Line, they were on their own, literally, because there was no power on these tracks. But this had overhead power, and that's what it still looks like. This is the Reading Viaduct, and Philadelphia is hoping to turn this into another success story, another park that adds immensely to community open space. There is that same birch seeding in. This is old railings by Station and Goldenrod seeding in on the viaduct. That's what it looks like right now. These are all eupatoriums, grasses. See these latticed catenaries. There's an old station out there. See the rails along here? Now, I've been in horticulture and landscape for a long time. I love these patterns. I'm happy to say I love these patterns. But you know, if you said to me, make a landscape like that and then work with it. I know what the plants are. I know these little poas and aristides. I know what these are, but I don't really know how to do this or to manage it over time. We have been so interested in controlling things that we just plant in order and keeping them in order. We don't know that much about this. And anybody coming to this field now interested in the field of landscape ecology and urban planning and design needs to figure this out. It's a wide open topic of adventure. That's an iPhone photograph. I had the iPhone and the 5D2 out there. I took shots at the same time the iPhone beat the 5D. So there you go. And I didn't even have the HDR on. So now there have been some other places that were done before the High Line that still have some things that might inform what might happen at the High Line, at the rail yards. I want to show you a couple of these. This is the Landschaftspark in Duisburg Nord. It was done by Peter Latson and company, a fabulous design group in Germany. Latson's retired now, pretty much. This is a huge site. It's 500-acre former steel mill. It's legal to climb up there. They have a sign at the gate that says, "Don't check your brain before entering." And that's all there is to it. You can walk in and you can climb where you like. So I was legally walking up there, taking that photograph. What are you looking at here? Do you see any order in those plantings? Anybody see any order in those plantings? Sure. Look it. There are lines here. There are lines in there. But they're not lines here. So there's order and there's not order. See the order? Order and spontaneous vegetation. This is a good model because it shows that you can actually take an inventory and say, what's there, what's valuable, what fits with the design, what fits with the function of this new landscape we're imagining, and keep what is valuable and conservable, and then redo what you must. On the ground, the new plantings, order. Take a child in a stroller for a walk. It's very easily accessible, very easily understood landscape, very friendly landscape, an intelligible landscape. And if I just go off to the side, I see that there is the line where wildness starts. We can have these things segueing one to the other. And it costs money to put these trees in these rows, and there might be really good reason to do that, but this is pretty low cost. I love this aesthetic, just like I love the pretty gritty up here. I love the way the landscape park there has taken its own white birch. It's European birch, which is happy there because their nights cool down. And these birches are part of that landscape. If you said, okay, I'm going to put some sculpture in a landscape, would you design me one of those? It'd cost you a pretty penny. So if we can say this is part of our history, whether it's the riveted facade of the High Line or these fabulous mills in the Ruhr Valley. You see this entire sweep? There's not a single plant there that was planted. That's all spontaneous vegetation. What I like about this photograph is that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people out there that are a whole hell of a lot younger than I am, and not one of them has a little digital widget in their hand. They're all engaged in the landscape. And they are aware. I'm taking these with a 300 millimeter lens, and she has figured out that somebody's taking her picture. You see the change? They're aware. They're looking. They are out there looking. They're keyed in. So what are they in? They're in an old steel mill. Nobody planted that buddleia. That buddleia, just like it was the plant that filled post-war London, post-Blitz London was filled with buddleia, creating all these warrens where generations of kids played. Well, it's doing the same thing in these post-war sites in Germany. Talk about a size of a landscape, look at the scale of it. Here's one high line in that space. They took all these areas that at one time had refuse in them, they had materials in the making of steel, and they've made them into garden rooms. Now let's say I said to you out there, those of you who might fancy yourself a garden designer, why don't you do that? Why don't you figure out how you'd make gardens in these spaces? Some of them we're going to give you a budget for, some we're going to give you no budget for. Well, here's one you got a budget for. So there's one of those, looks into one of these spaces. Now I'm going to go back up and I'll climb 200 feet in the air and take a picture down. You ready? Now this is order within wildness. And they can afford to do a certain amount of that. Certain amount of clipping of hedges, this wonderful big hydrangea aspera. But they've also got places like this, which are entirely happenstantial landscapes. Or places like this. Look at these highly organized stairs going down. These are places you can walk. It's part of the public park. They're doing remediation, and they're doing it with order. So if you want to take some of these soils and you want to do something that is easily resolvable and has a beauty, I like order as much as anybody does, or like much as some people do. And this is pretty to my eye, but that's serving a purpose. This is not irrigated. These are all things that will grow in gravel and damaged soils. Here's another incredible model. This is the Nature Park Schöneberger Segelinde. This is in a Berlin suburb. It was a rail sorting yard that went back to the 1880s. This is the yard as it was in 1934. It wound up when post-war, post-Second World War, Berlin is split. East Berlin gets control of the trains. They stop the trains moving west. All of a sudden, this sorting yard has no trains. So it goes derelict. It's derelict for 50 years. People start living there. People start doing artwork in there. And then the Technical University of Berlin starts doing some ecological studies, and they realize, oh my God, this is a nature reserve. And they finally wound up preserving it as a nature reserve. Art is the nearest neighbor to wildness. That's what it looks like. They have no rules against graffiti. I'm not in authority to have an opinion or make a decision about that. But there they have made the decision that if you allow it and you approve it in certain areas, you can basically confine it by understanding the culture. Now, if I said, okay, let's go to LEED standards, the commercial standard in the States, which has a lot to do with how you move materials in, how you move materials out, what kind of expense goes into the doing of things. I'm going to take a place that was a rail yard, and I'm going to take ballast from the site, and I'm going to tamp it into select tracks and make paths. I'm not going to move any materials in from outside. All I'm doing is reusing things from in the site. I'm not taking anything off the site, and I have sturdy, permeable pathways. I'd say that's pretty good design. That's actually higher than LEED Platinum. This is a place that's about pattern. In some places, you can just walk the tracks with what ballast is left between them and look at the pattern of the birches. In some places, the trees have seeded in and the trackways could not be made directly into paths. So in that case, they did this bar grading. There's a lot of bar grading along the High Line just to raise it up. They're on these Core 10 barrels with Core 10 edges. There's Core 10 on the High Line. And I'm actually trespassing here because this is a preserve. We were there with professionals that day, but this is a preserve site where they're actually studying the ecology of a regenerative rail yards. And they really don't want people walking off there. So what do? They just put something that's 18 inches above there, and you know what? It's uncomfortable enough to step down 18 inches that very few people, except photographers from North America, do so. It's about pattern. Now, the reason he didn't run when I took this photograph is because he's allowed to do this. I don't think his work was particularly good, but there was some good work there. And I can't help but say that I think that there's some beauty in this. But this is part of a different approach to culture. I mean, I think Berlin followed New York into graffiti, and now it's going all over the world. But some of this work is good, and some of it isn't. And I thought that one in particular was worth the photograph. But when you look at this topsy-turvy world of native and exotic, and I have certainly spent a good deal of my career working to try to articulate and preserve the possibility of keeping and treasuring and enhancing and managing our legacy ecologies, I'm happy to say I think that's okay. This is a North American red oak, and it's their weed. But we're losing our red oaks here. We have a lot of diseases after our red oaks. So as a landscape planner and designer, I am reluctant to plant oaks in spaces where I've got to guarantee them, but they don't have those problems in Germany. So is it okay that oak, they did not paint the tires on that locomotive to match that oak, it's just happenstance, but there is an exotic invasive species from North America that may be the future habitat for red oak. I don't know. But I know that those trees are healthy, and a lot of my local oaks are not. That whole aesthetic is really gaining ground in Germany. This is Gleistrack. This is just getting off one of the S-Bahn stops and looking at old spaces. There's a wonderful article that actually Paul showed me years ago by somebody I think from University in Basel. It's called Eulogy of the Void. It's talking about all these spaces like the High Line that they're opened up for some reason. It's a war, it's the demise of a railroad, and they become spaces. And obviously, when I started up here in 2002, people have been walking this for a lot longer than that. There was plenty of evidence of human culture evolving on the High Line, and there's been plenty of evidence of human culture evolving in these spaces in Berlin since the war. This is their native Calamagrostis epigeos. This is the native European birch. Well, this is 2 years ago, Pete Adolf and I were on the same conference in Berlin. This is all a professional group. We're actually out there in former East Berlin looking at a landscape that's part of what you might call the projects in East Berlin, looking at ways to understand how to manage this vegetation to make it even more useful as a park without wiping the whole thing out and replanting the whole thing. Now, if you notice, these folks out here are not waiting for the park sign. They're already out there with the dog throwing a ball. There are paths through here that people have made. I actually think it's more interesting that they've got the gas lines painted. But there's Pete. This guy has done most of the big landscapes in Munich. And we're out there looking and studying and talking about what's going on here. What about these patterns of the calamagrostis and the shrubs and the roses and the ashes and all these things, and how could you just gently intervene? This is taken with a little GH1 translucent mirror camera. How could you just gently enhance the pattern that exists? This is last fall with Pete in the Pine Barrens. Those of you that are over 100 years old might remember the Blue Comet was a train that took people from New York City down to Atlantic City, and it rode these rails. And we were out there that day looking at these rails and a landscape that is built almost entirely on sand and gravel. It's so dry. So what grows there is part of a palette that Pete is interested in, because it could be that palette that fills in places that might not have any more resources that are now on the rail yards now. Not an irrigated landscape, not a fertilized landscape. The rail yards are still a magical wild garden. They have their own mood to them. Again, Joel Sternfeld last week was very eloquent about growing up in places like this and having a deep love for them. And I think part of the reason that these places are so full of intrigue is because they are full of chance. You just never know exactly what's going to happen there, and I think that's part of the exploration. I went up a few weeks ago, and since I was a kid, my parents used to take me to the Empire State Building and go see dinosaurs, and so I have these indelible associations of dinosaurs and diesel fuels and the Empire State. At the time, I'm sure I looked down and saw the rail yards, but I never noticed it then. You can still do this, so just get yourself an express ticket. Well, this is Melissa and the Highline staff, and this is Peter Del Tredici out there this April. We're out there botanizing on the rail yards. We're out there looking to see what grows. Yes, we're looking to see if there's some rare new mint that's never been spotted in New York growing on the High Line. Yes, Steve Glenn, who's part of the New York Metropolitan Flora Project, found that. But Peter was just as, and he's a head research botanist for, this is Yuli Lorimer from BBG. Peter was excited to see all of the mix of things. He has a wonderful book called Wild Urban Woodlands. Urban Plants, Wild Urban Plants. Put just Peter Del Tredici in Google and find it. It's a great book. If you want to learn about all these plants working in the city, that's it. I took this photograph that day because I was trying to find a way to make Oriental bittersweet look beautiful, and it does. In my area, this is public enemy number one. It's pulling down the forest. But up on the High Line, it's one of the ones that gets by. Here is Peter, absolutely ecstatic with this. And I knew that there were a lot of crab apples up here, but crab apples are so promiscuous, I mean, you just don't want to go there. And so Peter's saying, oh my God, that's Malus baccata. It's the Manchurian crabapple. Well, he knows this because the Arnold Arboretum and all their explorations in China were involved with bringing these things in. Look at that. Happy as, and he told me I could use these photographs. I said, I'm going to make you only look like Robert De Niro on a good day. And he said, you can use any kind of photographs you want. But Peter is an incredible scientist and a student of these landscapes. We're out there. We're now at the rail yards, right at Javits. And we're looking at this beautiful, this is the same tree that those nice folks at DEA were trying to stop me to take a picture of. And there it is. And Peter said, the reason that grows up here is that crabapple, unlike many, is a real runner. And he was showing me how the roots are running. We were doing little excavations. And so it takes a little science to understand why can something like that persist for decades. Well, its habitat and its shelter and its sustenance. By the time we got out there, Steve was happy to see there were 3 different species of poplar growing out there, and I was happy to catch a little movie of a woodpecker in the middle of Manhattan on a poplar growing in the wild section of the rail yards down by Javits. There's habitat out there that we don't even know about. I don't know what will happen with the yards. I can't think of anything but that they will become part of the High Line. And any of you that have any resource, even if that is just your voice, speak out about it, because I think it's just a marvelous part of the park. It is just a natural part of the flow. And even though there are big plans to develop that space that is now occupied by the Long Island Rail Yards sections, this area, which looks out over the Hudson, will potentially be always there. Anything that would be built would be on the east side of it. So this view out there would always be open. I think it's just important to remember that if you believe in this, it was Louis Pasteur, and he was not making this quote to speak to gardeners. Chance favors the prepared mind. A place like this teaches you to look. It teaches you about the art of observation. And I think if you're looking for intrigue and chance, maybe a little, as John Stilgoe says, a little bit of directed serendipity, the Highline is a place to find it in its wildness, past, present, and future. Thank you all for having me here tonight. Saturday? I'm going to go upstairs.